They had called it a friend's rehearsal, which meant that the house, ordinarily hollow with the space of other people's laughter, had been seeded with the gentle rustle of silk and the pause of careful remarks. The Halcyon Theatre, once a music hall before its elevation to seriousness, retained a suggestion of velvet and ghosts. The lobby lamps were shaded in rows, the staircase spiraled up in discreet flamboyance, and everywhere there hung the scent of powder and lilies, and a faint chill from the stone. Lady Hermia Vane presided without announcing that she did so. She wore black jet and a perfectly judged smile that did nothing to conceal a fine and official boredom. "Aubrey," she said, with a glance like a touch of her fan, "if your stage manager will let the curtain breathe for one moment when the lovers go off, we shall all pretend you intended it." Aubrey Kestrel, producer and impresario, tall, dapper, and untidily elegant in the manner of men who affect not to notice their own charm, bowed to the observation. "My dear, if the curtain breathes at all tonight, it will be out of relief. We've sewn the thing with such diligence it can scarcely draw breath." He flicked his gaze across the dark mouth of the stage. "Rowan!" From the shadowed prompt corner, Mr. Rowan gave a grave nod that might have served at a funeral. "We'll take our ventilation when we can, sir. Miss Vale is ready." Miranda Vale, stepping forward into the lamped space, did not at once look ready. She had the stillness of a woman who knows that stillness is her weapon. The voice, when it came, would be low and shaped, but now she kept that in reserve. In her hand she carried a small, silver-handled fan that did not belong in the 16th century setting of the cypress door, and therefore must be personal. Hugo Dacres, her leading man, affected ease in a doubly buttoned coat and the faintest of lurches that might have been nerves or an untimely memory of champagne. They had the curious, separate intimacy of stage lovers who dislike one another exquisitely. "Felix," said Lady Hermia, inclining her head towards the playwright in a manner which implied that she descended to his level with kindness, "you will be pleased to see your third act uncut." Felix Corrin, narrow, scholarly, and wrapped in a muffler despite the overheated box, grimaced. "I shall be amazed to see any act survive Mr. Kestrel's scissors. One writes for silence, and one is given music. One writes for pause, and one is given applause." "Don't be beastly," murmured Daphne Lanchester, Lady Hermia's goddaughter, a pale, eager girl with youth's sincerity arranged like a hat which could be taken off if it failed to suit. She had slipped away from her aunt's orbit to stand at the edge of the stalls beside the aisle, where she could see Hugo's profile tilted towards Miranda. Her hands, ungloved, betrayed that she had never learned to be still. "He hasn't cut it very much. Only that bit about the scholar in the cloister." "That bit," Felix said, with the faintest lift of eyebrow. "Did some work." General Sir Julian Lanchester, Daphne's father, the stripes and medals now invisible beneath the sobriety of evening dress, inspected the house with proprietary distaste. He had put money into the cypress door as one hoists a flag, reluctantly, from duty. "If there is to be music," he said to Leonard Bellamy, the production's financier, and, contrariwise, a man who liked to be mistaken for a colonel when it did him no harm, "let it be the right sort, none of your incidental caterwauling." Bellamy's smile sat badly on his face, as if it had been rehearsed for another role. "We pay for taste and get fashion, but if the girl's any good, we're safe." He meant Miranda, and the certainty with which he meant her did not sit well on him either. Mr. Swithin of the Argus, the critic, sat 2 rows behind, his pencil moving without sound. He had that disconcerting capacity of his profession to appear to be thinking of something else while absorbing everything. He glanced briefly at Miranda, wrote down something that could have been beautiful or careful, and then drew a small box around it as if he had meant neither. Backstage, there were the simple rituals that have less to do with acting than with preparation. A dresser's pin between teeth, a shoelace knotted and re-knotted, Mr. Rowan's half-hour, that fell like a psalm. Mrs. Frayne, the wardrobe mistress, who held affection like a festival and secrets like a religion, slipped behind Miranda with an adjusting pinch and a murmur that was almost maternal. In the corridor, the stage doorkeeper, Grote, spread his newspapers like prayer books and looked up only for people of consequence. "Places, please," Mr. Rowan called, and the theatre took a breath, the way a lake will take a breath when the oars are lifted. The scene was skeletal but graceful, a suggestion of cypress shadows painted onto a grey drop, a door carved with symbols that meant more to the mind than to the eye, a low stool, a bowl for petals, and, to the side, the immense neutral weight of the main house curtain held like a held opinion. At Mr. Kestrel's signal, the rehearsal orchestra made a timid statement and immediately fell silent, as if discovering it had presumptuously interrupted something older. Miranda crossed to the door. Hugo watched her with a handsome carefulness that, under the looks from the house, contracted into politeness. He took her hand when he should, released it a beat too soon, and glanced, very slightly, into the dark as though to confirm an audience. It was a small infidelity that only Felix seemed to see. They ran a scene without incident. Miranda's voice had a novel clarity that made people lean forward. Hugo's replies were brighter than the words. Once, in the stall's aisle, Daphne suppressed a little exclamation, and General Lanchester, with a whisper that carried, told her to remember herself. All was social, contained, exact. In the pause that followed, the curtain stirred. It was no more than a sigh of heavy cloth responding to draught, the sort of movement that every theatre produces from a hinge, a rope, a tired pulley. Yet Rowan, in the wing, looked up. Aubrey Kestrel lifted his head in the same instant, and then made himself smile because he had been seen to notice. Lady Hermia's fan moved once and was still. Mr. Swithin drew another box around his earlier word. "Run the second entrance," Kestrel said softly. "And for God's sake, let's have no heroics." They did as they were told. They always did. The sound of familiar lines made a fabric over certain discomforts. If anyone, then, had a reason to look twice at the fat velvet fall of the mane, if anyone imagined that something lay quiet behind it, well, that was the sort of thought civilized people set aside until it must be entertained, and it had not yet become necessary. By 10:30, the meridian had shed its brilliance and retained only its quiet. The last of the motors drew away from the curb. The soft thunder of the city resumed its indifference. Within, the gallery's lights were muted to a lower register, as if the pictures themselves had retired from display and were content to observe in the half-light what men and women made of them. The scent of lilies, brought by someone with a sense of occasion, hung in the air with the less poetic, clean odor of waxed wood. Constance Vale, who directed the meridian with a headmistress's grace and a collector's nerve, supervised the small rituals of closing. She moved among the empty flutes and the napkins folded with a precision that tried too hard, issuing low-voiced instructions to the junior attendants who slipped about like apologetic mice. There was a finality in the click of a glass as it was set upon a tray, in the soft chime of a dropped spoon, in the discreet cough of the caretaker somewhere at the far end. Sir Alistair lingered before the veiled garden. It occupied its own short wall in the side gallery, a curious little room fitted up with velvet portieres to control the glare and to flatter the sense that here, if anywhere, art might lean close and confide. The title seemed, in retrospect, uncomfortably apt. He stood with his back to the door, one hand against the frame as if testing its sturdiness. His profile, caught by the half-shade, was exceptionally fine and curiously empty. When he spoke at last, it was to no one in particular. "Constance," he said, and Miss Vale, who had been noting something in her diary at the entrance, looked up. "You saw Thorne?" "I don't recall him making his ceremonial leave-taking." She considered. "A quarter of an hour ago, perhaps. He drifted. He has that trick. I thought he'd found the private view more stimulating than he expected." Her tone suggested that stimulation, in Mr. Thorne's case, often connoted annoyance. "Owen," she added, turning to Sir Alister's secretary, who was disentangling a long list of names from a blot of ink. "Did Mr. Thorne leave any message?" Owen Marsh shook his head. He was a slight, fair-haired man with a hesitancy that might have been either timidity or economy. "Nothing. He asked for the lighting to be lowered in the side room. He said the canvases breathed better in half-light. He had his notebook." He glanced, as if by accident, toward the portières beyond Sir Alister. "Mr. Swithin, will you?" Mr. Swithin, the caretaker, had materialized soundlessly from one of the recesses. He was the sort of man the well-to-do hire to ensure that doors do not slam and staircases do not creak. His hands, large and capable, bore the faint sheen of someone whose work is intimately acquainted with polish. "Yes, sir," he said, in a tone that made a courteous nothing of the syllables. He moved toward the velvet curtains and, with a professional eye, reached to loosen the left-hand tie-back where the cord had somehow been drawn off-center. There was, for no reason at all, a faint stir in the air as he parted the curtains. A draught came from the unseen window. The lily's scent seemed stronger. Miss Vale, who prided herself on a certain firmness of nerve, felt a prickle along the scalp. Owen's fingers, resting on the list, stilled. Sir Alister turned. Julian Thorne was there, not in the vivid dramatic attitude that the newspapers prefer, but with a small, discourteous slump that suggested sleep in the wrong chair. The armchair in the corner, deliberately placed to allow a contemplative view of the veiled garden, had received him. His head had fallen forward a little, his chin not quite upon his chest. His spectacles, which he had worn at a weary angle all evening, were more so now. The knot of his tie was impeccable. Only there was the matter of the cord. The velvet tie-back, thick as a man's thumb and the same deep-sea blue as the portière, had been taken from its brass hook. It lay about his throat with that terrible exactness that is almost neatness. It had not been knotted grotesquely. There was no ugly testament to struggle. It had been drawn and fixed somehow with a craftsman's restraint. The mark it made was no more than a thin line, like the impression left by too stiff a collar. No one cried out. Mr. Swithin, who had parted the drapery, let the fabric fall instinctively back, so that the scene became a dim-framed thing. Sir Alister took one step and stopped. Miss Vale's pen made a tiny clicking sound against her diary. "I think," she said, as if discussing a mislaid catalogue, "that we will telephone the police." Owen had already crossed to the wall and lifted the receiver. His hand seemed steady. "The yard?" he asked. "We are the Meridian Gallery. There has been—" He looked at Miss Vale and found no better phrase. "An accident," he said to the unjudging instrument. "A person is found. You will send someone." Sir Alister, after a moment, bent, not touching, to look at the critic's face. It had already acquired that quality that separates the very newly dead from the sleeping by a margin that is at once minute and infinite. He straightened slowly, as one who has climbed a stair to find there is no landing. "Mr. Thorne," he said very gently, as if the name itself were a kind of apology. Venetia Fairfax, who had lingered for no reason she could have explained, was standing at the threshold of the room. She had intended to say something light to Sir Alister, something that would recapture the easy authority of 10 years past. Whatever it was, it did not come. She looked at the slight figure in the chair, and then at the blue cord. Her hand tightened on the clasp of her bag. After a moment, she stepped back without sound into the corridor. Miss Diana Westbrook had been laughing at something one of the junior attendants said about the difficulty of removing candle wax from silk. Her laugh stopped with a neat closure, and her eyes, which had the bright keenness of someone whose experience outruns her judgment, grew grave. Mr. Swithin, moving with that deftness which makes itself invisible, had noticed other things. The brass hook from which the tie-back had been lifted was slightly bent, as if from an impatient hand. A champagne flute stood on the low table at Thorne's elbow. It was 3/4 full. On the table itself, a faint crescent showed where a damp base had rested and been moved. The leather notebook that had traveled with Mr. Thorne like a familiar was not to be seen. He did not comment. He drew the curtains to a discreet gap and stood aside. The room, with its hushed air and its blue velvet, had taken on the unreality of a stage awaiting its actors. Outside, the city went on with its patient business. Inside, something unconnected with art lay very quietly among the trappings that had been arranged to flatter it. "They will come," said Miss Vale. "We shall do nothing until they do." Sir Alistair put out his hand and touched the edge of the frame of the veiled garden, as if to steady it or himself. In the painted depth, the pale path ran between dark hedges to a place where a veil was suggested rather than shown. He looked at it and did not seem to see it. Somewhere, the outer door closed softly. The meridian settled once more into its cultivated silence and waited. Chief Detective Inspector Roderick Alleyn entered the Meridian Gallery with that deferential unobtrusiveness which reassures the conscientious and disconcerts the guilty. He removed his hat as though the pictures might require the courtesy, and the gesture, mild as it was, steadied the 3 people who had kept vigil. Miss Constance Vale, immaculate even at this hour. Owen March, pale with a controlled anxiety that made his hands unnecessarily precise. And Mr. Swithin, whose silence had about it the weight of custom rather than shock. "Good evening," Alleyn said, as if the hour and the occasion had not conspired to make nonsense of the phrase. "We'll keep this as unruffled as your profession demands, Miss Vale. If you please, no one in or out." Brer Fox, large and deliberate, took his place by the door with the naturalness of a well-bred butler addressing a draft. Alleyn glanced once around the main gallery. Light collected like warm honey on the canvases. The air held that mixture of varnish, polished wood, extinguished candle wax that galleries contrive without candles. A program lay folded upon a marble plinth. Beside it, a tiny crescent of drop dash suggested Mr. Thorne had transgressed the house rule with a critic's sense of personal exemption. It told Alleyn, as neatly as a card, that the dead man had felt himself privileged, perhaps even indulged. "The alcove is through here," said Miss Vale, her voice low and directed. She did not attempt to lead him inside. Alleyn paused just before the burgundy portieres. The right-hand curtain hung unrestrained. Its tie-back, a twin of the one he had been told was missing, lay against the panel, its tassel fixed at the regulated height with the impersonal correctness of institutional taste. The velvet nap on the left showed a faint, rucked line where a hand had drawn it farther across than usual. Alleyn touched the pile gently and it yielded, then sprang back. He noticed, too, the curtain rod's faint metallic whisper when Fox, at his nod, eased the portiere aside, a noise like the intake of a careful breath. Julian Thorne sat as they had said he sat, composed, knees together, shoes properly aligned, the head at a slightly contemplative angle as if considering the composition. The burgundy cord had been looped about the throat with a competence that discouraged heroics. It was not a clumsy improvisation, but something managed with forethought, the tassel tucked almost tidily beneath the chair arm. The knot was not theatrical in its flourish, yet there was in its neatness a certain studied hand. Alleyn thought of the way a dresser in a theatre arranges a scarf to look accidental. He noted the spectacles, square, modern frames, correctly placed. The notebook lay open on the critic's lap, an empty page presented with the politeness of a blank visiting card. There was no pencil. A half-moon indentation marred the top edge of the paper. Something had pressed there and been removed. Alleyn glanced to the floor and, kneeling, found a short pencil under the chair, rolled against the skirting. The point had snapped cleanly. The broken tip was not in sight. "There's no sign of struggle," Fox murmured, as if apologizing to the dead man for saying so. No, Alleyn said. He may not have understood until it was finished, or he understood perfectly. He looked past the chair. The Veiled Garden, he read from its small plaque. The painting's light had been adjusted for intimacy, the pool of illumination contained so that the edges of the alcove dissolved into velvet shadow. It made an island of brightness in which the critic's stillness acquired an air almost devotional. Alleyn took in the chair's angle in relation to the picture. It was not exactly centered. A trifling displacement, but in a room like this, ruled by exactitudes, trifles were declarations. He looked at the carpet, dense, expensive pile with a faint bloom where feet rested. Behind the chair, slightly to the left, the pile bore a delicate comma-shaped bruise, as if a narrow heel had turned there once. Decisively. He did not point it out. On the mantel shelf, if such a thing might be said of an alcove, stood the adjustable rheostat for the spot. The control lay a fraction lower than the mark Miss Vale's staff had penciled to indicate the preferred setting. A habit had been broken here. Someone had made a private adjustment. He bent closer to the cord. A faint dusting on the velvet, a pale lichenous smear, had caught on the nap. Paint, perhaps. Not conclusive. Galleries are full of such ghosts. Still, he filed it. Dr. Curtis will be here directly, Fox said, having padded away and returned with that information as if he had fetched a shawl. The yard's photographer, already summoned, unpacked his impedimenta without noise. Alleyn stepped back to allow the camera to occupy the breathing space. Mr. Swithin, Alleyn said at last, in the tone one uses with good servants, neither deferential nor commanding. How many doors are there from this alcove? Only the portiere, sir. The service door beyond is locked. Miss Vale keeps the key. Miss Vale offered it, lying on her palm like a coin. It is always locked during an exhibition. We do not encourage shortcuts. Nor should you, Alleyn said. He did not take the key yet. He looked instead at the dead man's mouth, a faint bluing at the line of the lips. Nothing coarse. The skin below the ligature showed a clean pressure. Whoever had tightened the cord had done so without disturbance. Not a garrote in the penny dreadful manner. Something quieter, in a world that moderate, perhaps even considerate. Sir Alistair Finch, he asked, not looking up. I sent for him when Mr. Swithin came to me, Miss Vale said. He had left, I believe, for his club. He is on his way. And the others? A few patrons lingered in the main room. Lady Hermione Carrington departed shortly before 10:30. Miss Venetia Fairfax remained for a private word with Sir Alistair. Miss Westbrook, she is with a set that does not keep hours, left in a hurry. Mr. March can provide names. Her voice did not falter. It was as if she read a list of donors. Alleyn inclined his head. He looked once more at the picture, at the suggestion of a figure behind veiling foliage, the careful distances between forms. He felt the weight of the room's propriety pressing upon the fact of the crime, and knew, as he always knew at such moments, that the delicate structure of civility would show him where it had been bent. "We'll see them in a moment," he said, still to the room rather than the people in it. "For now, no one alters anything." He replaced his hat on the bench beside the alcove, a small domestic gesture that strangely asserted possession and let the curtain fall back into place. Outside, the gallery waited with that fixed, genteel patience which in such houses of art is indistinguishable from reserve. Fox took up his post by the guest book. Alleyn stood for one more measured beat, letting the silence offer what it would, and then turned toward Miss Vale with the faintest of smiles. "If you would be so kind," he said, "we'll begin with whomever remained the longest." Alleyn accepted Miss Vale's offer of a chair in the smaller reception room just off the main gallery, a cool, tasteful space with a lacquered writing table and 2 upright armchairs positioned for conversation rather than comfort. The murmur of subdued movement from the larger room, Fox's low voice instructing a constable, the faint clink of glass as Swithin quietly removed temptations, hung like a veil over the door. Somewhere, a telephone bell sounded and was promptly stifled. "If you will, Miss Vale," Alleyn said in his civil, unhurried manner, "let us begin with what is least coloured by conjecture, times and dispositions." She had regained a formidable poise. Guests began to depart at 10:30. A few were later, Lady Hermione, who is always punctual about her leave-taking, Mr. Thorne, who asked for a moment in the side gallery, and Sir Alistair, who wished to satisfy himself about the lighting. I remained in the main room speaking with Ngaio Marsh. At approximately 10:50, Mr. Swithin informed me of what he had discovered. Mr. Thorne asked for privacy. "He did not use the word," Miss Vale said. Her tone suggested she rarely needed to hear words to understand intentions. But it is not unusual for critics to linger. One must balance propriety with accommodation. The portiere, who draws them ordinarily? Swithin, or I. For this work, Sir Alistair occasionally preferred them more nearly closed than I do. He maintains the shadows, adjusts the viewer's perceptions. Alleyn made a small note. "And the tiebacks. Do you recall their position when you last passed?" Miss Vale's lashes lowered. "I do not. I'm not sure one does register such things consciously, Inspector." "No," Alleyn said equably. "One often doesn't." He let the silence sit for a measured beat. Mr. Thorne's reputation was considerable. "In this world," she said, "influence can be more malleable than it appears. Mr. Thorne's pen has, at times, been adventurous." "A euphemism?" "A practicality." He inclined his head as if for a small bow. "Thank you, Miss Vale." "Mr. March." Owen entered at once, as if he had been waiting just beyond the door. He was composed in the manner of the well-trained young man whose importance lies in being useful. Alleyn noticed the careful way he closed the door, the brief glance at Miss Vale that asked and received permission to speak. "You saw Sir Alistair last?" "At 10:35, sir. He said he wished to look at the veiled garden as it would look to a solitary stranger. He enjoys the phrase." "Did he indicate whether he would be long?" "No, sir." "And Mr. Thorne?" Owen considered. "He spoke to Sir Alistair during the evening. A few remarks, light enough, but Mr. Thorne's lightness can chafe. Then he moved about, made notes. Later he asked Miss Vale whether he might sit in the side gallery. He went in at, I think, 11:15. Alleyn watched him. "You have a very good recollection." "I try, sir," Owen said. It was both explanation and modest protest. "Was there any invitation to Mr. Thorne to return to the gallery tomorrow?" "I believe he intended to send the review in by morning. He prides himself on promptness." "Quite." Alleyn's gaze dropped and rose again. "You assisted Sir Alistair with the rheostat sometimes?" "Yes," Owen said. "He likes the mark." He stopped. "Sir Alistair prefers the pencil mark to be respected. I attended to it earlier." "Very good. If you would be so kind as to write out your timings." Owen half bowed and withdrew. Swithin, summoned by a nod, took his place with the contained quiet of a man who understands the theatre of discretion. "You found him?" "Yes, sir." The custodian's hands were large and clean. He kept them folded. "You parted the curtain, saw Mr. Thorne seated and—" "Took a moment to be certain," Swithin said. "Then I let the curtain fall again and informed Miss Vale." "You touched nothing prior to that?" "Nothing, sir." "The curtain cord. Did you notice one missing on the entry side?" Swithin's eyes flicked, then steadied. "They match each other on both sides, sir. I cannot say what they were when I entered. I did not look at the fittings." "You've served here long?" 12 years. He allowed the smallest pride to surface. "We have only lately had these portieres retrimmed. The colour suits the room." Alleyn let his gaze rest lightly upon him. "You take trouble." "One does the work one has, sir." And tonight, was there any unusual movement? Someone returning after departing? A door where you expect quiet being disturbed? Swithin's pause was almost imperceptible. There was a draft through the rear service passage a little after 10:30. It happens if the outside doors. Not pushed quite to. I attended to it. Thank you. Alleyn let him go. Fox's careful face appeared round the door. Dr. Curtis is on his way, sir. Photographer setting up. Shall I send in Sir Alistair? Alleyn nodded. If he is ready. Sir Alistair Finch entered like a man stepping onto a stage he had helped design, not theatrical, but conscious of the frame. He looked very tired. His evening's polish had dulled at the edges. His intelligent, remote eyes flicked toward Miss Vale, accepted her composed presence, and settled on Alleyn. Inspector, a wretched business. Miss Vale has told me only what is necessary. I regret the necessity, Alleyn said. You saw Mr. Thorne this evening? I did, Sir Alistair said with easy courtesy. He delivered some airy nothings about my courage and my cowardice. He finds courage when one changes and cowardice when one does not. I dare say he has a template. You mind criticism? Not especially, Sir Alistair said pleasantly. One minds irrelevance. Mr. Thorne had a gift for making himself central. And after you spoke, I walked. One must circulate. His tone suggested the tedium of such duties. I looked in at my painting near the end. The light was half a tone off. I supposed Miss Vale had altered it and meant to put it back. Then I was, he smiled faintly, waylaid by a charming woman who wished me to explain my veils. I'm afraid I was not equal to it. Do you recall the time? About 10:30. I left the alcove empty then, Inspector. Did you later see Mr. Thorne go in? No. I saw him only in passing earlier. He held his little book like a priest his breviary. Alleyn watched the face that gave so little but registered everything. You have many admirers, Sir Alistair. Some of them were here tonight. Miss Venetia Fairfax, for instance. A distinguished sitter, he said lightly, and a friend. She left a scarf, Alleyn observed. Did she? He sounded genuinely detached. Venetia mislays things. She finds that it makes men useful. Sir, Fox said from the doorway, the doctor asks if you wish him to proceed. In a moment. Alleyn rose. Thank you, Sir Alistair. We shall trouble you again. Out in the main gallery, the quiet industry of officialdom had imposed itself without vulgarity. The photographer's flash was hooded. A moth's puff of light. Swithin had vanished as if absorbed by the woodwork. Alleyn paused beside the guest book. Between the cramped signatures and flourishes lay a single deliberate omission, a line left blank where a name should have been. He traced it with his eye only, and did not touch. He looked toward the burgundy curtains where absence had arranged itself into silence. Then, hearing the soft retreat of a servant's step in the service passage, he thought, not without appreciation, that this house of art had been built upon routines as exact as any ritual, and somewhere within that ritual a hand had hesitated and then moved. By the time Dr. Curtis had offered his quiet, professional arithmetic of death and the photographer's bulbs had puffed their discreet little ghosts, the meridian had subsided into a late-hour hush. Miss Vale arranged for tea as if it were a prophylactic against calamity. Fox moved, notebook in hand, through the more pedestrian business of names and times. Alleyn slipped off into the quieter margins where certainty is usually stored. He found Swithin in the narrow service passage behind the smaller gallery, standing before a modest sink upon which a chamois and a brush had been laid with punctilious care. The man's jacket had been buttoned anew, his cuffs exact. He might have been polishing the idea of order. You have a way with quiet, Mr. Swithin, Alleyn said. It makes one think you have an understanding with rooms. Swithin inclined his head. One tries, sir, to preserve the intention. What is the intention here? The meridian prefers to be looked at rather than heard, Swithin replied, not quite meeting Alleyn's eye. Miss Vale finds that to be the correct atmosphere for consideration. Alleyn nodded. And consideration, this evening, failed Mr. Thorn. Tell me about your usual round at closing. Swithin's hands, honest, well-kept, twined for a moment. I move from the main hall inward, lights to the penciled mark on each rheostat. Tie backs set so the curtains drape evenly, stools tucked, the small brush for the carpet pile where guests have stood too long. Fingerprints off the glass, if any have trespassed. Alleyn smiled slightly. And this evening, a fractional pause. This evening, some of those items required attention twice. Twice? The rheostat in the alcove was a point below Miss Vale's mark at 10 past 10. I meant to correct it when I had dealt with a spill in the East Passage. When I returned, the man's gaze flickered toward the burgundy curtain. There was no question of adjustments. You noticed the tiebacks? Of course. They are generally looped in a simple drape, sir. Not knotted. Alleyn let that rest. Who was in a position to alter your arrangements? There were still several persons in the main room. Swithin said, carefully general. Sir Alistair, Miss Vale, Mr. March. 2 ladies, Miss Fairfax and the younger Miss Westbrook. Lady Hermione had left. He sounded as if reciting a catalogue. Nothing more. And the critic? He went where critics prefer to go, somewhere they can be alone with their opinions. The faintest breath of disapproval, not of the man, perhaps, but of the disruption. Alleyn followed the small movement of Swithin's eyes to the brush. You take pride in that carpet. It shows everything, Swithin said, especially what one would rather it did not. How much of it did you persuade to forget? Swithin's silence was, for a moment, almost companionable. Very little, Inspector. I have a sense, perhaps you share it, that one ought not to tidy away what belongs to others. And yet there is that little crescent of ash in the main room. The gentleman smoked, though Miss Vale does not encourage it. He did not tap his ash wholly upon the tray, Swithin said, with that particular brand of neutrality which is in itself a disclosure. Did you see anyone go in or out of the alcove once the guests had thinned? The custodian considered. One saw figures cross and pause. The curtain is courteous. It conceals while one finishes one's thought. I could not say who was thinking. It was deftly said and thoroughly unhelpful. Alleyn took from it, nonetheless, an impression that Swithin had seen more than he was prepared to grant a stranger, and that his loyalty was not to individuals, but to the meridian's intention. Show me how you set those tiebacks, will you? Alleyn asked. Swithin obliged without fuss, passing into the main gallery, and, at Alleyn's nod, demonstrating with the opposite curtain. Fingers placing the velvet rope in a smooth loop, no knot, an elegant fall like a well-tied cravat. It was a small ceremony, done with an ease that bespoke muscle memory. Alleyn watched the particular turn of the wrist, the absence of fuss, and stored it away. He left Swithin to his implements, and found Owen March in the director's office, where a decanter had been set out for show and not touched. The secretary stood with the appearance of composure that belongs to those who have chosen not to feel until later. Mr. March, Alleyn said, and let the warmth of his voice do the work Miss Vale's tea could not. You had the care of Sir Alistair this evening. I have that care in general, Inspector. The young man's fair face was paler than before, his hands correct upon the back of a chair, not quite gripping it. I make arrangements. Did you arrange Mr. Thorn's last half hour? A flicker. He preferred to make his own arrangements. But he was expected? Owen's gaze slid by Alleyn's shoulder. He is an important critic. That is not a no. It is not a yes, Owen returned, almost apologetically. Sir Alistair's professional life is sometimes conducted at the edge of formality. One cannot always give it a timetable. Alleyn let the silence grow until it was almost companionable, and then said, very gently, What did you tear out of your notebook when you went to the telephone, Mr. March? The smallest possible intake of breath. An untidy page, Inspector. Untidy or indiscreet? Owen's restraint did not break. It merely altered, as if a shutter had been closed with the light still on behind it. I should like to answer all your questions. I cannot answer that. 1. Alleyn inclined his head, as if conceding a point in pleasant fencing. For the moment, then, you'll forgive me if I notice that for some here, the correct thing is to say nothing at all. It is sometimes the only thing one can afford, Owen said, and then, because he was young and decent, added, I don't mean money. No, said Alleyn. Nor do I. He left the office to the quiet tick of its clock and the corridor to Swithin's discreet economy, aware that the Meridian's intention was being tested by the simple, devastating fact that its people knew more than they were prepared to say. In such places, it was rarely accident that gave one one's clue. It was habit, and a habit, if watched long enough, has a way of betraying its keeper. By morning, the Meridian's grandeur had resumed its cultivated aspect, though the hush had thickened into something almost ecclesiastical. The official business of the night, photographs, measurements, Dr. Curtis's carefully phrased preliminaries, had been completed with the neat efficiency of a well-rehearsed drill. The alcove, shorn of its occupant and stripped of its unhappy elegance, looked oddly modest. A chair slightly off-center. A curtain with one side tied back, the other hanging loose like the unbuttoned sleeve of a well-made coat. Alleyn returned with Fox, while the light was still a pale wash on the walls. Miss Vale had drawn some of her composure about her like a shawl. She had come early, she explained, to make a list of what must not be touched. Swithin, in his dark coat and careful shoes, stood as though awaiting the beginning of a familiar ceremony. Owen March, pale and dutiful, occupied a chair near the guest book table, an unopened notebook in his hands. I think, Alleyn said, in that quiet tone that always produced order without fuss, we should see the ordinary business of this room properly performed. Mr. Swithin, would you indulge me? Pretend we are at the close of last evening. What is your routine? Swithin inclined his head. It was clear he found relief in the request. At the end of any viewing, sir, I draw the portiere to the exact mark so that the lights fall correctly on the painting. I check the rheostat back to Miss Vale's pencil. She prefers an eighth above mid for this piece. And I set the chair straight to the line on the carpet tape. Then I loop the tiebacks, left and right, so there's no strain on the fabric. After that, I see to the side door and the skylight bolts. Would you demonstrate? The custodian went to the rheostat first. He looked at it as one looks at a household god. You will see it was lowered, he said, not quite reproachfully. Below the mark. He made a delicate adjustment. The light deepened subtly. The veiled garden, even empty of its spectator, regained its poise. He stepped to the chair and nudged it with invisible geometry until it aligned with a narrow line of faint tape half hidden in the pile. Alleyn watched the small exactitude with appreciation. Ritual, properly apprehended, had a habit of telling the truth. And then the curtains, if you please. Swithin reached for the right-hand cord, and his hand stopped in midair with a slight, almost private intake of breath. Well, he said softly. He glanced at Alleyn. May I? By all means. Swithin drew back the burgundy velvet on the right and revealed the surviving tieback looped about a brass hook. His long fingers touched the cord with something like recognition. They were changed on Tuesday, he said. The cords. I rotate them each week. The velvet fades imperceptibly, and there's less stress if one alters their side. Miss Vale leaves such things to me. Yes? Swithin lifted the cord and turned it. On the concealed side, near the tassel, a minute stitch of blue thread had been worked into the piping. I mark them, he said, faintly apologetic. Left and right, sir. A blue stitch for the left, red for the right. Only on the inner seam where it doesn't show. This one should be left, but it's on the right. He let the cord fall and looked at the opposite curtain, which hung slack without its partner. If the right was used last night, it should have borne the red. Fox, who had moved nearer, made a small noise in his throat. So whoever replaced the curtain after didn't know your habit. Miss Vale, who had drifted closer despite herself, frowned. I had no notion of this fuss of stitches. Mr. Swithin, you never troubled me with it. It is my business to trouble myself, madam, he said gently. Alleyn said nothing. He bent instead to the empty bracket on the left, where a faint smudge marred the lacquer, paler than the surrounding gloss, an abrasion that might have come from a knot drawn tight, then hurriedly jerked free. He put his finger to it and found nothing of substance, only the suggestion of disturbed polish. He straightened, letting his gaze travel to the small comma of heel press still visible in the pile behind the chair and to the rheostat's penciled universe. The first was decisive, the second discreet, the third exact. Taken alone, each meant little. Together they made a quiet shape in the mind. Who, besides yourself, touches these things? He asked, almost lazily. Miss Vale, Swithin answered, and Sir Alistair on occasion, for the light. Mr. March does not. The attendants wouldn't come in here unasked. His expression remained unchanging, but there was the faintest delay before he added, and the decorator, once a month, for the dusting of the rails. Mr. March. Alleyn turned his head. Owen looked up quickly. I never interfere with the displays, Inspector. Sir Alistair is particular about light. He asked to look at it before leaving. He said the picture was a degree too bright and wished the setting lowered until it's breathed. That is how he put it. Alleyn's eyes rested for a thoughtful moment on the young man's careful face, then returned to the cord. We'll make a note, he said to Fox, who already had. A blue mark where a red should be, a habit misconstrued or ignored. He walked then to the desk where the guest book lay open with last evening's cascade of names, loops and slashes in various hands, the addresses an anthology of good streets. Beside Thorne's signature there was no flourish, no small arrow sketched in the margin as he was said to favor. Another routine interrupted. Thank you, Mr. Swithin, Alleyn said. That will do for the present. They left the alcove as one leaves a chapel, and the curtain fell back with its single surviving ornament not quite in its customary place. Alleyn paused and, with a small, unshowy movement, set it true. He did not explain the gesture. Fox, who had been with him long enough, did not ask. In the outer room, the telephone gave a discreet whir. Miss Vale moved instinctively to answer, checked herself, and looked to Alleyn. He inclined his head. She lifted the receiver, listened, and her face altered by half a shade. For you, Inspector, she said composedly. A message has just been left at Sir Alistair's studio. It is odd. She offered the instrument and stood very still while Alleyn took it, his mind holding as lightly as dust the pattern the morning had revealed. By mid-morning, the Meridian Gallery had resumed its habitual quiet, though the quiet seemed thinner than before, like silk gone delicate with handling. Alleyn returned with Fox to find Miss Vale at her desk, her composure intact but taxed, a small stack of morning correspondence untouched beside a silver letter opener that caught the pale light. I thought it best not to proceed without you, she said, indicating a single envelope set apart from the rest. This was found under the front door when Mr. Swithin arrived, not posted. The paper is of indifferent quality. Alleyn took the envelope. It bore his name in a taut, carefully unremarkable hand. Inside, a single sheet, typed, Miss Vale will kindly destroy all notes of my discussions with the gallery. They misrepresent my conclusions and would do further harm. No more letters. J.T. There was a brittle impersonality to it that seemed more artless than discreet. Alleyn read it twice, then glanced at the typing. The letters carried a little limp on the lowercase e and a faint misalignment on t, a pair of eccentricities that, once seen, would be difficult to forget. "Mr. Swithin," he said quietly, "was the building perfectly secured last night?" The custodian, materializing with his accustomed absence of fuss, inclined his head. "Doors and windows checked twice, sir, before and after the police departed. I remained until nearly 2. I will say." He paused, choosing the precise shape of his words. "This morning, the umbrella stand in the vestibule contained an item that was not there when we locked up." He produced, with that odd mixture of reverence and reluctance reserved for objects newly promoted to evidence, a cane. Its head was carved ebony, discreetly handsome, its ferrule unremarkable save for a minute smear of pale residue lodged in the narrow groove between metal and wood. "Mr. Thorne's?" Fox asked, already matching the object to last night's absences. "Yes," Swithin said. "He never left without it." Alleyn examined the ferrule, then the handle. The polish on the ebony had been interrupted by the lightest scuffing, as if by a ring worn by an impatient hand. "And this was not present when we concluded?" "No, sir. I swept the vestibule myself," it would have been observed. "So someone returned," Alleyn said mildly, "to supply us with an article that would have been awkward to account for." Miss Vale's fingers tightened around the letter opener. "A person with keys? Or with intimacy?" Alleyn said, almost as if to himself. Fox, whose gifts included a talent for timely arrivals, produced Dr. Curtis's preliminary note. "Time of death between 10:15 and 3/4 past, sir. Ligature marks consistent with the cord from the curtain. There are slight abrasions on the right index and middle fingers, not easily accounted for by a passive death." Alleyn looked at the cane again. He imagined a hand seizing its polished head, another hand steadying a cord in a motion executed with precision and restraint. The rheostat, he recalled, had been set a fraction low. It would be possible for a man in the shadows to make of darkness both ally and disguise. "Miss Vale," he asked, "how many typewriters in the gallery?" "2, she said. "One in this office, the other in the small study off the preparation room. The latter is kept for visiting artists. Sir Alistair uses it when he wishes to appear businesslike. He dislikes it." "Would you oblige me with a few lines typed on each?" "The same sentence will do." He handed her the note. "Perhaps the veiled garden admits no noise, if you will." She inclined her head and rang discreetly. Ngaio Marsh appeared, obedient and pale, and took the request with the subdued efficiency of a man accustomed to errands, though something in the line of his mouth betrayed a private calculation. In a few minutes he returned with 2 slips, each bearing the requested phrase. On one, the E sat too low by a whisper. The T climbed by the same whisper, as if attempting an escape. "The study machine," Owen said, not meeting Alleyn's eyes. "It has been in need of service." "Quite so." Alleyn folded the slips. "We shall keep these if you don't mind." Swithin, patient as oak, ventured, "There's another thing, sir. The side door to the study. We've had trouble with the spring. It catches unless you lift as you shut. This morning it was snug. One can only achieve that fit by drawing the bolt first." "So someone left that way," Alleyn said, "and returned the same way later to place the cane and perhaps deliver this delicate communication." A telephone bell sounded in the outer room, incongruously domestic. Miss Vale lifted it, listened, and her complexion cooled a degree. "Lady Hermione," she said to Alleyn. "She asks if you would come presently to Sir Alistair's rooms. He is, she says, indisposed." There was, in Lady Hermione's voice as it came tinny through the instrument, that particular firmness reserved for directing the aftermath of an awkward scene. "It is not serious, Inspector, but he is shocked and speaks of postponements. There has also been an unfortunate misunderstanding about a letter." "Another letter?" Alleyn asked gently. "A note," Lady Hermione returned. "Slipped beneath his door in the small hours. He won't show it to me. Venetia is there. She is being useful." Alleyn replaced the receiver with a touch as careful as if the instrument had become fragile. The gallery, which had seemed a stage grown still after its curtain, had stirred again. Subtle movements behind the portiere, the sort that alter scenes without changing the furniture. "Fox," he said, "ask the constable to keep our doors watched. No more anonymous missives, if we can help it. Mr. Swithin, the cane, if you please. Miss Vale, we'll trouble you later for the keys to the study door." He took up his hat. The day had performed its second, quieter turn. It had not shouted. It had breathed differently. By late afternoon, the meridian had regained its cultivated quiet, that special stillness of rooms accustomed to the measured footsteps of patrons and the respectful murmur of trained guides. Alleyn requested that the doors remain closed to the public. He liked rooms that had resumed their customary pulse. One heard the telltale changes then, the different timbre of the air when it flowed through a space that had ceased to perform. He began again at the alcove. Fox stood back while he adjusted the rheostat to the penciled mark and then lowered it to the fractional setting at which Swithin had found it. The painting altered its character at once. The garden's veiling deepened. The light loosened its hold upon the central figure, a woman half-turned among latticed shadows. Alleyn allowed the gloom to thicken and imagined the chair occupied, the critic's profile caught in the softened glow, the curtain cord drawn forward from the left bracket. The blue thread cord. The ignorance of it was important. A creature of the house would have known. The small abrasion on the left bracket whispered of haste and of a hand not perfectly familiar with the fitting. And the comma-shaped heel indent placed behind the chair, no more than the pressure of a narrow heel, turned once with decision. He remembered Diana, Westbrook's shoes, slender, needle-pointed. Venetia's too were finely made, but with a softer lift. Miss Vale wore the thicker heel of efficient women. Lady Hermione, sensible, if elegant. The catalogue of shoes offered itself with faint amusement. At times, one felt that murder was curiously dependent upon the habits of dressmakers. He regarded the tie-back cord as Dr. Curtis might have taken a pulse. There was, along one edge, a powdery aura, pale, not white, with a faint greenish cast. The same lichenous smear he had noticed last night. On the cane's ferrule, Fox's hand lens had shown a similar residue lodged in the groove. If it were mere plaster dust from the gallery's cornice or chalk from the hanging lines, it should have been whiter, cleaner. This had the tone of gesso rubbed into canvas and picked up, perhaps, from a studio floor. Sir Alister's private study communicated with the preparation room, and the little side door had been ajar in the morning. If the cane had been used as a tool, an extension of the hand to draw or hold the cord, or simply dropped in a place where the air tasted of ground chalk in size, it would explain the residue. But why return it, theatrically, in the umbrella stand by dawn? Because its absence had been noticed. Because absence can be as eloquent as presence. Someone who understood that small things shout in quiet rooms. Fox joined him and offered the anonymous letter again. "Same defects on the study machine, sir. Owen says only he, Miss Vale, and Sir Alister use it. Yet a key to a door lies easily in a pocket that carries other people's errands," Alleyn said abstractedly. The phrase, "a concerned observer," sat with faint artificiality on the page, neither vulgar nor striking, but correct in a manner that suggested a mind schooled to social acceptability. He heard it in Miss Vale's measured intonations. He could place it in Lady Hermione's vocabulary. Owen would imitate it from those he served. Sir Alister might parody it. Venetia might avoid it altogether. He left the alcove and walked the main line of the exhibition, letting his eyes submit itself to shadows and substance. In the third room, a smaller canvas of a garden stair caught him, a figure seated, turned slightly away, the angle of the wrist familiar from The Veiled Garden. He moved closer. The lattice work in the background. Yes, pattern for pattern with the larger piece, though subtly altered in scale. Even the break in the vine, the notch where leaf fell away, recurred. Thorn's magnifying glass came back to mind. If one looked hard enough, under the finished paint a ghost might remain. An earlier drawing, a transfer, a motif lifted and reset. Influence, or more than influence. The critic had spoken to several about provenance, about influences not acknowledged. Alleyn felt that odd movement of mind, which was not yet conclusion, but the recognition of a path. He stood a moment before the guest book. Thorn's signature, stripped of its flourish. In that clipped hand, a man preoccupied, eyes not upon his own name, but upon what waited beyond the curtains. He had telephoned no one, written nothing. He had sat, and perhaps someone had come to stand behind his chair, and perhaps a hand had rested, almost affectionately, upon the back before the cord lifted. One kills more readily from in front in anger. From behind, one kills more easily with composure or necessity. The murderer must have been a figure whom Thorn did not fear standing there. A woman he knew, a man whose authority had long since ceased to be questioned. Alleyn thought of Sir Alister's cufflinks, worried with restless fingers, of Owen's careful obedience tightening into anxiety, of Miss Vale's orderliness as a bulwark against professional disaster, of Lady Hermione's kind cruelty that called itself patronage, of Venetia's silence, shaped like a refusal to recall an old intimacy, of Diana's brittle mockery, sharpened by youth's need to wound. "We'll have the framer's account," he said to Fox, who had drifted within earshot. "Deliveries for the past month, and inquire at the colourman's about Sir Alister's purchases, gesso, grounds, rabbit skin glue, transfers, anything suggestive of underdrawing. Quietly, no gossip." "Yes, sir." "And the keys," Alleyn added. "Every key to every door, traced. We'll not accept the polite assumption." Fox went off with that solid absorption which was his talent. Alleyn remained. It was his habit, when the factual field had been staked out, to let other evidence settle, the unspoken, the familiar missteps, the little treacheries of habit. He had seen crimes accomplished by people who would never raise their voice at dinner. Silence had its own grammar. In the Meridian, it conjugated itself along walls hung with effort and pretexts. Someone had written a note to sound reasonable. Someone had slipped a cane back into sight to sound innocent. Someone had misunderstood a custodian's quiet system of chords because they did not live here. He turned once more to The Veiled Garden. Through the carefully deepened light, the woman's face now hovered in almost the same relationship to the chair as a living face would have done to Thorn's shoulder. It was a trick of angles, nothing occult. But if Julian Thorn had found in that veiling not mastery but appropriation, if he had thought to publish it, then the motive was neither art nor passion. It was reputation, the most civilized of urgencies. Alleyn drew the curtain back to its proper brace and let the light return to the penciled mark. The room recovered its intended clarity. He felt not satisfaction, but that poised attentiveness which precedes a movement, the bow drawn back but not loosed. He would speak privately next, not to accuse, but to listen where words tended to harden. The hour for a quiet conversation approached, and with it, perhaps, the first admission that would make the rest inevitable. By late afternoon, the Meridian had been coaxed into a semblance of calm. The doors remained shut to the public. Within, the paintings resumed their unruffled watch, and the smell of polish had reasserted itself over last night's perfume. Alleyn, who disliked the crude machinery of melodrama, asked those most concerned to gather in the main gallery under the discreet glow of the track lights. The effect was of a drawing-room postponing tea. He began with the courtesy of small matters. Keys first, Miss Vale produced her ring with a professional click Swithin his with the habitual gravity of a man for whom metal teeth and responsibility were kin. Sir Alister admitted possession of the study key for work undertaken on site, while Owen, in a voice correct but strained, confessed that he occasionally held the key at Sir Alister's request. Lady Hermione, Venetia Fairfax, and Miss Westbrook had none. The spare, cut for a contractor months ago, was, Miss Vale insisted after consulting a neat ledger, duly returned. If the night visitor had come by key, it was not an obvious one. Alleyn asked for the tiresome favor of footwear. One by one, with varying degrees of amusement or indignation, they obliged. Fox, with paper and a soft pencil, took an impression of the comma-shaped dent still faintly readable in the carpet's pile. He compared heels without comment. Miss Vale's were sober, square, and practical. Lady Hermione's, elegant but sturdy, left a clean oval. Venetia's were narrow and unmarked. Miss Westbrook's, fashionably sharp, bore a tiny nick on the rubber that might, in certain carpets, have printed a flourish. Fox's pencil hovered, then moved on. Alleyn did not look at Diana. He looked at Sir Alister's hands, which had begun, almost imperceptibly, to fidget. "Indulge me a moment more," he said, and crossed to the rheostat. He lowered the light a fraction to the same understated register recorded last night. The painting retreated into its own silences. The wing-back chair recovered its morbid importance. "Sir Alister, will you sit as Mr. Thorne preferred?" he asked, and the request was framed as deference to the artist's eye. Sir Alister complied, lowering himself with a stiffness that was not merely physical. His glance moved to the picture and then, reflexively, to the control. One long finger lifted, stopped, dropped again. "Not your preferred setting, I think," Alleyn observed mildly. "No," Sir Alister said after a fractional pause. "I mark it there for a reason." "Quite. Last night it was altered." Silence accepted the information like a butler receiving unwelcome visitors. Alleyn let it remain until it threatened to become a third presence, then relieved it with urbanity. "A note was delivered this morning," he said. "Anonymous in tone, not in character. It was typed in the study on the machine whose T&E have lately developed a personality." His gaze moved without accusation. And Mr. Thorne's cane, absent at a critical moment, obligingly reappeared in the umbrella stand. "These are considerate attentions, too considerate." Owen flushed and then whitened, a young man caught between loyalty and discretion. Miss Vale's fingers tightened on her keys. Venetia, who had been careful to be merely present, looked not at Alleyn but at the picture, as if the painted veil might lift of its own accord. Lady Hermione's profile expressed a composed impatience with vulgar necessity. Alleyn dismissed them, almost. "I have only one more inconvenience to impose. Mr. Swithin, would you be so kind as to escort Lady Hermione and Miss Westbrook to the staff entrance and show them the bolt and chain? I wish to be certain of timings." He turned to Fox. "The ledger for last night's closing, if you please." They dispersed obediently along the prescribed lines. The gallery, briefly, contained only Alleyn, Sir Alister, and Venetia Fairfax. The quiet altered. It became not absence of noise, but presence of thought. "You were quite devoted to Mr. Thorne's work, Miss Fairfax?" Alleyn said, almost conversationally. "To his accuracy," she replied. "He did not confuse charm with truth." "And truth here concerns the origin of a composition," Alleyn suggested, his attention ostensibly on the blue-marked curtain cord. "An origin that would have proved awkward to acknowledge in print. There is a garden somewhere, is there not, that precedes this one by years?" Venetia's eyes widened briefly, then shuttered. "There are many gardens." "Some with veils," Alleyn said. "Some with curtains." Sir Alister stood, too quickly, and steadied himself on the chair back. "Inspector, I must protest this line of—" "I have not asked a question, sir," Alleyn said gently. I've only observed that Mr. Thorne, who brought a magnifier to a private view, had begun to compare what is present with what is remembered. He allowed himself a small sigh, almost sympathetic. He was a man to see beneath paint. The door at the far end clicked. Footsteps signaled the return of propriety. Alleyn let the moment pass. He did not seize it. He turned to Venetia with the faintest suggestion of apology. "If you would be so kind as to meet me in the study in half an hour. A brief word about your modelling days, nothing more. We shall be dull and precise." To Sir Alistair he offered the courtesy of privacy. "And you, sir, later this evening, I should like, if you can bear it, to look with you at 2 earlier canvases. We shall avoid questions. I suspect we shall find them unnecessary." Sir Alistair's shoulders lowered a fraction, as if some sentence had been deferred rather than commuted. The company reassembled. Alleyn, with his habitual grace, thanked them and released them to their several dignities. The collective calm held. The confrontation had been as soft as velvet and twice as enveloping. Yet the air had altered. Politeness had thinned. Beneath it, motive breathed. When the doors closed behind the last guest, Alleyn stood alone before the veiled garden. Dust motes turned in the diminished light like thoughts made visible. His intuition had settled, not as a verdict, but as a shape. He did not name it. He only marked, with the care of a man setting a rheostat precisely to line, the hour he would ask it to speak. By late afternoon, the meridian had resumed its practiced poise, as if a building might, like a well-bred person, compose itself after shock. Miss Vale gathered a small company in the principal room. Lady Hermione with her tolerant grief, Miss Fairfax withdrawn to a quiet angle of the carpet, Owen March pale and overcorrect in posture, Diana Westbrook vivid with incomprehension, and Swithin at his accustomed station near the portieres. The paintings watched with their usual indifference. Alleyn did not stand in the center. He occupied the margin, as if to allow the room its own dignity. Fox, unobtrusive, took up a position by the door. "I promised you discretion," Alleyn said, and his voice, though clear, seemed to lower itself in deference to the place. "You shall have it. A man has made a statement. The broad lines must be known to those whom the matter most nearly touches. The particulars will find their appropriate channels in due order." He did not look at the veiled garden, yet it was as if the picture presided. Mr. Thorne's inquiries were not idle. He traced certain inconsistencies in Sir Alistair's development to a source. A painter named Marcus Whitmore exhibited once in 1924, and not again. Sir Alistair purchased Whitmore's work during a period of illness, subsequently exhibiting portions under his own name. The arrangement became habitual. When Whitmore sought acknowledgement, the matter ended. Unhappily. Mr. Thorne, being diligent, discovered letters, traced relationships, and came last night with his notes to compare the masterwork with earlier conceptions. Miss Vale's hands, folded upon the back of a chair, tightened once, then were still. "We shall provide every document the authorities require," she said. "I will inform the trustees." Lady Hermione's fan, long unused, made an absent-minded half-movement. "Tragedy where talent ought to have sufficed," she murmured, with the dry moderation of her class. "It is nearly always character that proves unequal," Alleyn continued gently. The method was as restrained as the setting. The velvet cord, this one, he inclined his head toward the right-hand tie-back, was removed from its proper place, applied without struggle. In the exchange, a small error. The custodian marks left and right, with colored thread on the inner seam. Blue belongs to the left. It reappeared here, on the right. Swithin's eyelids lowered in a brief assent, his discretion intact even in vindication. "The rheostat," Alleyn went on, "was set a fraction below Sir Alistair's penciled preference, enough to alter the surface reading of the paint. Mr. Thorne had been examining technique. The adjustment suggests someone who understood not beauty, but method. There was paint dust on the cord and cane, gesso most likely, from the stretcher edges in the preparation room. The little side door was found ajar at morning service. The cane itself was returned in the night, placed almost ceremonially. Such gestures argue agitation rather than cunning. Owen March found his voice. "Sir Alistair, did he?" He could not finish the polite sentence. "He has given a formal account," Alleyn said. He typed the anonymous note on the study machine in a last attempt at deflection. It was unworthy, but not, perhaps, incomprehensible under the strain. He will not resist what follows. Diana stared at the painting. "But it is still beautiful," she protested, with the candor of the very young. "Surely that remains." Miss Fairfax answered her without moving. "Beauty doesn't conceal the hand that placed it where it is. It only makes the concealment more comfortable, until it doesn't." "Art survives its makers," Lady Hermione said, with that cool fatalism one hears in old houses. "But one would have wished the maker equal to it." Miss Vale lifted her head. "The collection's integrity must be addressed. Attribution corrected where required. The meridian will withstand what it must." "It will," Alleyn said. "And for what it's worth, Mrs. Higgins will tell you that the floor is more forgiving than we are apt to be. It keeps no grudges against the feet that pass." No one smiled. The hour did not invite it. Yet the remark took a little of the sting from the air. "Does he intend—" Miss Fairfax began, then stopped on the edge of something harder than pity. "He intends to come with me," Alleyn said. "But first he asked, within reason, to take a last, quiet look at this room. I thought you would prefer it so, rather than a scene on the steps." Swithin inclined his head. "We shall make a clear path, sir." They stood aside, instinctively drawing back into the margins of the room's long perspective. Presently, Sir Alistair entered with the quiet of a man who has learned there is nothing left to hurry. He paused beneath the central light and raised his eyes to the painted garden. Whatever moved across his face was private. He did not speak. He did not defend. After a moment he inclined his head, not to the crowd nor to the law, but to the work itself, and let out a breath one felt more than heard. "Shall we?" Alleyn asked, with the courtesy one might use at the end of a good dinner to a host who had done his best. Sir Alistair gave a slight, correct bow. To Miss Vale, another to Lady Hermione, and a smaller inclination toward Miss Fairfax that contained apology without plea. He went out between Swithin and Fox with the decorum of an old actor leaving the stage on a final cue. In the emptied space, his absence enlarged itself. The portiere swayed almost imperceptibly, recovering its balance. Somewhere far back in the building, a clock marked the hour with a soft obstinacy, as if to say that time, being innocent, would continue. "Inspector," Miss Vale said, in the tone with which one makes an entry in a ledger, "you will let me know when I may begin the inventories." "You shall hear from me tomorrow," Alleyn replied. "There is a way to do these things that is least harmful to all concerned." He took up his hat. "We will attempt it." Fox held the door. The street beyond had acquired the bluish clarity that precedes evening. The car waited without emphasis. Inside, the man who had wanted a last look at his borrowed garden sat with his hands composed upon his knees. Justice, or something that closely resembled it in a tidy world, stood a few paces off and did not raise its voice. By late afternoon, the meridian had composed itself into a kind of ceremonial quiet, as though the building understood it must receive consequences with decorum. The alcove where the veiled garden had presided now showed a pale rectangular ghost upon the wall. The painting had gone into police custody without fuss, wrapped in muslin by gloved hands. The velvet portiere had been lifted down and folded neatly, their burgundy subdued into obedience. Mr. Swithin, having made a careful note in his ledger, returned the tie-backs to their proper brackets with an unostentatious satisfaction, blue-marked cord to the left, red to the right, as if setting the gallery's ritual to rights might, in some small way, restore its order. Miss Vale received the discreet calls a woman in her position must endure. Trustees, a journalist who phrased his request as a courtesy, a collector whose voice measured value in guineas even as it professed distress. She answered them with a polished restraint that did her credit, acknowledging neither scandal nor innocence, only the institution's duty to cooperate fully and to preserve, as far as possible, what might be salvaged of integrity. Twice she looked toward the empty alcove, and twice she turned away, as if refusing some private calculation. Lady Hermione arrived with the silence of a well-kept motor and the efficiency of a corrective breeze. She asked for Alleyn and received him in Miss Vale's office as if this were a drawing room and not an antechamber to disaster. "So it is to be official?" she inquired, her tone without drama. "It is, Lady Hermione. Sir Alistair has made a statement," Alleyn replied. "He will be charged." She inclined her head as one acknowledges inevitable weather. "Then we shall do what we can to prevent vulgarities. There is an art to ending things, Inspector. One must compose the final impression." "Sometimes," Alleyn said. "The composition suggests itself." Venetia Fairfax appeared shortly afterward, dressed with her habitual care, though the effect was different now, less studied glamour than armor. She offered Miss Vale a ring of keys, Sir Alistair's spare to the studio, another to an inner cupboard, and placed on the desk a small brown envelope. "It ought to belong to someone who knew him before the story changed," she said. "Marcus Whitmore's photograph. He kept it behind a backing board. I suspect Julian found the original and forced it into light. Sir Alistair, when the light came, could only shade his eyes." She did not sit. "Say what you must, Inspector. I won't quarrel with it. We were all served, and all served him. That's the worst of it. Silence is not always kindness, is it?" "No," Alleyn said. "Sometimes it is merely comfortable." Owen March, pale but composed, stood in the doorway as she left. He did not enter immediately. His hands rested on the jamb as if asking for permission from the room itself. "Inspector, Sir Alistair asked me to arrange a solicitor and to inform the trustees." He was very clear. His voice remained steady, only the slightest tightness about the mouth betraying strain. "If there is a formal communiqué, Miss Vale, I can draft it for the board." Miss Vale thanked him. Alleyn watched the young man with the unobtrusive attention he reserved for those inhabiting the outer circles of ruin. Owen had not asked to be drawn into the gradient between genius and theft. Yet the ink from that particular script would not wash easily from anyone's hands. Fox came down the corridor with a sheaf of typed notes. "Remanded, sir," he said quietly. "Magistrate tomorrow." He was very composed at the yard, signed everything without quibble. "Thank you," Alleyn said. "Arrange for Whitmore's sister to be notified through the Brighton Constabulary. She needn't learn it from the evening editions." A hush passed through the gallery as if some inaudible bell had rung. Swithin's careful step crossed the main floor. He had brought out the small step-ladder to remove the brass plaque beneath the empty space. He polished it once with a folded cloth before slipping it into an envelope and writing, in square, clerkly hand, "To be held in abeyance." He did not look about for approval. Near closing, Lady Hermione paused at the threshold of the emptied alcove beside Alleyn. "I do not weep for reputations," she said. "They tend to have very good lawyers, but I do for the thing itself, for the work which must now be named properly and will diminish in the eyes of those who only ever loved the name." "Some things look smaller when the light is corrected," Alleyn said. "Others larger. And the man. He has chosen his dignity, such as remains. It will not be theatrical." She nodded, accepting the terms. "You will come to dinner next week, Inspector. My nephew plays the piano abominably, and it will do for morale." When she had gone, Miss Vale replaced the telephone gently on its cradle and faced Alleyn with tired candor. "I shall write to Miss Whitmore and ask if she will allow us to hang his picture when the time comes. Properly labeled, it cannot unmake anything, but one can at least correct a noun. That would be something, Alleyn said. He walked once more through the main room. Shadows lengthened along varnish and gilt. Absence radiated its own peculiar presence from the stripped alcove. Behind the curtain, behind all curtains, there are always two plays, the one the audience admires and the one that composes itself out of appetite and fear. The trappings had been folded away. The stage waited. He did not speak of triumph. He instructed Fox to see the doors closed and the porter released early. Then he stood a moment longer in the doorway, watching Swithin lock the street entrance with the steady assurance of a man returning the world to its old habits. It was almost dark. Section 12 would belong to night. The evening papers carried it not as a banner, but as a column of careful inches. An arrest in connection with a death at the Meridian Gallery. Allegations under review concerning the attribution of certain works. No photographs of a man led in handcuffs, only a dignified line. Sir Alistair Finch assisted police with their inquiries. At Bow Street, Sir Alistair stood as if at a private reception, composed, attentive, drained. He offered no plea then, merely listened while the magistrate, with the professional weariness of those who have seen too many variations of the same grief, remanded him to custody pending further proceedings. Outside, the October air had thinned into iron. In the waiting car, Alleyn sat with the silence of a man who understands that some victories never feel like triumph. Concurrently, subtler mechanics engaged. Miss Vale, having telephoned counsel more for the gallery than for the man, drafted a statement with a clarity that owed nothing to sentiment. The Meridian would close temporarily. An independent panel would examine provenance. Any necessary reattributions would be conducted with propriety and without theatrical announcement. She requested, in language so calm it approached command, that collectors and institutions extend patience. Most agreed. A few in private did not. Venetia left the city for 2 days. She returned from Brighton with his small bundle wrapped in tissue. Letters from Marcus Whitmore to his sister, grateful, despairing, tender, frightened. In them, a young man's scruple wrestled with hunger and pain. A bargain emerged in hesitant strokes. He will exhibit them, Nell. He says it will help us both. I'm ashamed and relieved. If there is wrong in it, I pray art may forgive me. Miss Vale read the sentences aloud to an empty office, then folded them as one might replace a relic. Lady Hermione wrote to 2 trustees, elegantly savage. In our world, we have long accepted that surface may not precisely reflect structure. Let us not, having discovered the beam askew, pull down the house. Repair, attribute, acknowledge. Do not delight in ruin. It is so dreadfully middle class. Owen March resigned. His letter, neat, immaculate, contained no exculpation and no condemnation. My duties enabled a concealment I did not understand. That ignorance is not a defense, but an inadequacy. I remove it. He sent a small enclosure, a key to the study, and went home to a clean desk and an empty evening. Swithin, asked by the constable whether he had ever suspected, shook his head with professional humility. Not my place to suspect, sir. To observe and do as I am bid, only I don't care for curtains being swapped between brackets. It upsets the room. The constable, who had never considered the moral life of a curtain tie, wrote it down nonetheless. The veiled garden was removed from its alcove and rested, easel-bound, in the preparation room beneath a muslin veil. 2 conservators stood in temperate light and spoke in a language of craquelure and pentimenti. When they drew the cloth aside and tipped the rheostat up to its penciled line, infinitesimal ridges returned. A ghostly underdrawing, almost certainly Whitmore's hand, breathed through the paint like frost through glass. Julian Thorne's paper, incomplete but cogent, was delivered by his editor to a journal that does not pander. It ran under the title Shadows and Substance. Notes toward a re-examination. The prose was spare and unvindictive. It did not mention velvet cords. It held to the realm he had loved. His notebook, with its last blank page, was given to Miss Vale. She placed it on a shelf at eye level and found herself, each time she passed, not reading, but pausing. Sir Alister's counsel, a cultivated man with a talent for painful truths gently spoken, advised a plea that conceded causation and intended misdirection, but disputed premeditation. "You will be hated either way," he said, not unkindly. "This may permit you the small decencies left." Sir Alister listened and, after a thoughtful interval, nodded. He asked for paper and wrote 2 letters, one to the Whitmore sister, the other to Miss Vale. In both he asked forgiveness, and in neither did he offer a defense. The peculiar ironies of art completed their circuit. 2 collectors, having sworn to sell at once, found their appetite for divestment cooled by the steady hum of speculation. A painting that had once been a Finch and might soon be a Whitmore, or both, acquired, at least on paper, a value beyond either name. Lady Hermione, apprised of this, wrote another note. "Attribution is not speculation. If we must be base, let us at least be honest about the currency." Alleyn, returning late from chambers, paused on the steps of the yard and looked at the sky. London had applied its familiar gauze. He found himself thinking of the penciled mark on the rheostat and the hand that had set it, years and years, to a particular notch. Habit, once virtuous, had last night become fatal. It was not the worst metaphor he had seen. The gallery reopened on a grey afternoon, attended not by crowds, but by a few faithful clients and those whom duty or affection compelled. The walls bore new labels, some amended, some doubled. Marcus Whitmore, attributed, appeared beside 3 canvases, Whitmore/Finch beside others. Like a hyphen in a marriage that had never been blessed. A small card, placed with unsentimental gravity near the entrance, read, "The Meridian recognizes with gratitude the scholarship of Julian Thorne, 1894-1936, and announces the establishment of the Whitmore Fund for the study and conservation of under-recognized artists. Donations may be directed to the archivist." Miss Vale stood rather in shadow that day, listening to the soft footfalls of patrons who mastered, quickly, a new etiquette of looking. Swithin had the tie-backs properly restored, blue on the left, red on the right. He had permitted himself, in a moment of private rebellion, to polish the bracket until it shone like a bit of lacrimal silver in the dim. Venetia came in the last hour, when light is most forgiving. She stood before the veiled garden, now at its honest brightness, and did not cry. She merely lowered her eyes, as if acknowledging a person at a graveside. Lady Hermione joined her, offering no words. The 2 women made, without conspiring, an image of composure good enough to have been painted, if there had been anyone left who could do it unborrowed. Outside, Fox awaited Alleyn by the curb, his large figure patient among taxis and weather. "They'll charge him with murder," he said without relish. "And the older business, they'll open it." "They will," Alleyn said. "The laudanum, the letters, the Crown will do what it must. Even with the passage of time, the pattern is ugly." "Do you ever get used to the part where truth starts costing, sir?" Fox asked, almost apologetically. "For the ones who didn't do anything except be around?" Alleyn considered this. The river smell had wandered up the street and mingled with varnish, perfumes, a faint mineral tang from stone. "If truth were cheaper," he said, "we should have it everywhere, and it would be worth less. Though I grant you, the price is rarely paid by the right purse." They walked a little way in companionable quiet. Behind them, the Meridian's facade compiled itself into dusk. Somewhere, a boy shouted, and a cabman called to his horse with a gentleness no human being quite receives. Alleyn found himself thinking of Thorne's last stillness under the adjusted light, of a young man in 1924 making a bargain with necessity. of an older man smoothing his cuff and finding no seam that would lie flat, of tiebacks and tiny blue stitches, of a cleaner's memory of a door just ajar. "When we finish," Fox said, "it all goes in boxes, sir. Statements, exhibits, photographs, a label. Sometimes it seems, well, small." Alleyn's smile was not unkind. "Boxes are decent things, Brewer Fox. We put away what we can't stare at forever. But every now and then, someone opens one. That is what Mr. Thorne did. He opened a box and looked and paid for looking. If the rest of us, knowing that, put the lid back with care, perhaps it isn't nothing." They paused at the crossing. A motor bus sighed to a halt. The city made its endlessly civilized noises. Alleyn thought of the rheostat mark once more. A small pencil stroke set by habit, attended daily without reflection, until the day when to move it down became an act of murder. So much of life, he reflected, is the correct setting of light. He turned to look back along the pavement. Through the gallery's tall windows, the muslin veil had been lifted. The veiled garden shone in its admitted truth, less enchanted and somehow more alive. People stood before it at the proper distance, their faces quiet. No one spoke loudly. It was, at last, a room without pretense. "Come along," Alleyn said softly, and stepped into the road. In the gathering grey, the city accepted them both, and the river went on, making its patient, half-heard argument for the slow work of change.